Hello Mzansi, you're listening to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Food for Mzansi. Officially, this is the world's best podcast for 2024, as awarded by WAN IFRA, the global organization for the world's press. I am your host, Patricia Tembo. Welcome to episode 471. Today we're discussing crop protection methods. This episode is set to be informative and practical as we welcome agronomist and horticulturist Tapiwa Masimba.
Tapiwa Masimba, welcome to Farmers Inside Track. I'm quite excited that you're able to join us here on the podcast as well. Welcome.
Thank you, Patricia.
You are a very experienced horticulturist, but maybe you can give us an overview of your scope of work before we get into the topic of conversation.
I'm a horticulturist by profession, and I also have a degree in horticulture to support that. I studied in the Midland State University. Currently, I'm running my own company called Mass Fresh, which is supplying into all the three major retailers in South Africa, which is ShopRite, Checkers, Pick n Pay, and Woolworths. We're doing that, renting a brand, Little Farms, based in Centurion. So, in brief, I've got a degree in horticulture. I started working mostly during my work experience. I worked as a farm manager and also on the technical side as an agronomist. I worked for some of the major farms in South Africa, ZZ2, Organic Carrots Greenway Farms, the former Dew Crisp Farms, New Harvest Farms, which used to be called Tana Estates. So yeah, I've quite a lot of experience with working with different people, different strategies, different crops, and complementing it with what I had learned at school and also with the experience on the ground.
Thank you so much for sharing more about yourself. And we've been getting requests to talk about topics related to crop protection and pest control. So how do physical pest control methods differ from chemical and biological methods in terms of effectiveness and safety and efficiency as well?
Physical, the difference is more on the practicability of it and also the cost constraint into it. So farmers have a challenge in most cases whereby you want to avoid using chemicals at all costs. I think that's what every farmer's goal, to say we want to produce a food which is safe to the consumers, and you want to use as little as possible on the chemicals. But there are challenges within it whereby you find that physical pest control methods, in most cases, they have constraints in the practicability of it. If you have, in agricultural terms, pest control include weed control. The agriculturalists will understand me better there. If you look at the physical control methods like you're weeding physically and chemically, one will opt to go chemically because chemically you just put in a spray, it sprays all the weeds and then they die. Whereas if you go physical, now you have to weed manually or mechanically, but it's got a lot of labor input and it's also a time issue whereby you might spend a week or two where on a chemical control, if you put in a spray, it's just a matter of hours. In brief, I can say those are the major challenges which will make people choose chemical versus physical.
Maybe going into the more physical, you did mention weed control falls under this. What are the main physical methods that are used or that you see commonly used in your experience?
Not so much physical, where the most common ones which I've seen is whereby you try and set in traps. You put in traps where you lure the pests, can be a color, or you can lure it by a means of pheromones, but that will also be a combination of a little bit of chemical where you put your pheromones to lure the insects in there. That is most practical where you find people farming in enclosed structures, and also that will mean not so much like large scale farmers. Then you get also enclosures, which is also your insect net, your greenhouses. There will be a lot of control in terms of opening and closing of those structures. Some will even go a long way of putting alarms, a double door system where You open the outside door, the alarm goes on, you close it, you have to close it to open the other door while the other door, which is to the outside environment, is closed. So the alarm will there just to make sure that everyone adheres to that. So those are some of the physical I can think of. And you have also things like temperature control, whereby you want to try and eliminate certain pests which don't like certain temperatures. Blockages, making sure your insect net is intact in terms of no holes, no penetration of the insect. Those are a few methods I can say.
I was exposed a little bit to crop protection, and I'm thinking how it's usually classified under the 4 different methods, and the last one being chemical that you say farmers would typically tend to avoid. So maybe if you can just speak a little bit more about the physical, mechanical, biological, and those 3 when it's very necessary for chemical control methods.
In agriculture, they ended up having a term called IP, Integrated Pest Management, where they realized that you can't only do physical, you can't only do biological, you can't only do chemical. So all those methods, apart from these 3, they have to work hand in hand. And like you said, when do you have physical only? After physical, when do you say biological? When do you say then chemical? So it's a combination. It has to be a strategy. It has to be a strategy. And a strategy, if it doesn't have measurements, then it won't work. So I would say in most cases, you find that, okay, you have your net house intact, you have a net house in place. So there have to be continuous monitoring at the pest pressure. That a continuous monitoring of the pest pressure comes in with what we call threshold levels, where you say now at this threshold level, you now say the physical has failed. The structure, we're giving it as an example to say the crop is in a protected net house. Now there is pest pressure. So obviously the physical would have failed. So now we're saying, what's the next step? Then we can say, okay, at this stage, probably you can come in with your biological pest control. But also the biological methods, in most cases, like you have your biological sprays as well, they are mostly repellents. They just try to control and reduce and keep pest pressure at bay. Very few of them will kill. There are some which kills, but very few of them will kill your pest. So you want to try to suppress and keep the pest pressure at bay. Then you continue monitoring. It will come a time when you will say, at this threshold level, we should now start using chemical means. But it's a lot of things which involve the age of the crop, time to harvesting, and all those. So it's not as clear cut as I'm saying it, but yeah, there's a lot of things to consider. But in simple terms, we can put it that way.
You mentioned IPM, Integrated Pest Management, and a lot of other farmers I've spoken to, and I guess specialists in the field, obviously advocate for this because it's sustainable. Maybe if you can elaborate a little bit more about the importance of integrated pest management.
So the importance of integrated pest management, where I saw it being used at large scale and working. So they had farmed those like certain lands in the Moketse Valley where they started farming. So those lands have been farmed amongst generations from, I think the generation which is farming there now is probably the second, handing over to the third. So you can imagine those soils have been worked and worked and worked for a long time. So they started to see diminishing returns. And the only thing they had to go back to the basics to say, what are we doing wrong? Our fertilizer programs are spot on. Our spray programs are spot on. All the other things are in check. Then what is it? Where is the problem? Only for them to now go back and say, we are working against ourselves by only using chemicals. And what did they do? They formed what they call in Afrikaans natuurboerdery. It's also a practical, I think it's interpreted in English, it's just simply saying IPM in practice. So where they combined the chemical and the biological, they realized the chemical only cannot work. It will reach a time when you will start to get negative results because of overusing chemicals. Biology on its own cannot work because pest pressure, especially with that area where they have been farming monocropping, there are certain pests which are in the area for those specific crops they are doing. the tomato, for instance. So you can't also rely on the biology. So they combined the two. One good example is on nematodes. They got very good results with their product, which they produce from a weed extract. And then they put it into the soil as a biological weed extract, including a lot of microbes called EM, effective microbes. So that on its own took away chemicals into the soil, chemicals which works against nematodes. And also they spray some of those effective microbes on the leaves of the plants, though they will still come in with the chemicals. But what do is they kind of allowing nature. They want to work with nature. They want to work with biology. They want to work with the artificial, the chemicals. For the time I was there and for the time I also had to chat with a few guys from there, it's still working for them even up to now. And they then went from where they started seeing the diminishing returns to now being sustainable. So that was a very good practical application of IPM I've experienced.
Maybe we can shift the conversation to looking more at methods used to protect crop from the environment, and so not necessarily pests, but just from that environmental damage. And I think that's where things like shade netting also come in. Maybe you could speak a little bit more about the methods that are used for protection in the environment. And I guess it depends on where one is farming, the region as well. So knowing what they're susceptible to. You can speak a little bit more about that.
It's a method. In most cases, farmers who are doing intensive farming, they get to have a practical means of protecting their crops against the external physical damage which can happen to their crops, be it sunlight, be it hailstorm, be it wind, or whichever the case. Where, on the other hand, you look at farmers who are doing extensive farming. I'm talking of grain farmers where you get one farmer doing 2,000, 3,000 hectares of maize or of soya. So for them, it becomes impractical for them to prevent their crop against things like hailstorm with shade netting or anything like greenhouse structure, for example. So there are means in vegetables. Most people will go for shade netting. I've seen the most common, I think it's a 20% shade netting, where you try to shade off 20% of the light and allows 80%. It also helps in the winter time, where you find that under the shade net, in most cases, it doesn't frost unless if it's your black frost, which obviously you won't get results from a shade netting. But the normal frost, you can prevent your crop damage from that. So there is a shade netting, there is greenhouse structures. Greenhouse structures, they do work for certain high value crops, and I've seen them working for people doing flowers. I've seen them working for people doing microherbs, seedlings, and all that. But one has to take careful consideration when setting up or wanting to put a greenhouse structure into your farming, because then you should be aware of the costs, because with our climate and majority of the crops, it doesn't justify putting a plastic unless if it's a high value crop, because it's very costly, and also the result sometimes it will need high capital investment, whereas you can simply do it open field and get farms, the microclimates of South Africa, or get product from those regions. Also something to consider. So there is structures like your shade netting greenhouses. I've seen an old farm with a glass house, but I've never seen people using glass houses. But so in most cases, you see the shade netting greenhouses. Then in winter, you do see frost covers, which are temporary cover, blanket-like, where you put on top of the crops in winter to prevent them from frost damage. Again, it's mostly used with vegetable farmers.
Staying on the topic of, frost, we saw this winter how the black frost affected many farmers, especially in Limpopo. With that in consideration, what would you advise climatologists as well, as sort of saying that it's a lot of these events that we've experienced this year, there's probability that it will happen again. So what would your advice be for farmers who, suffered from the black frost or, lost crop during the winter period? would you advise them to then look into the temporary coverings, or are there alternatives?
My personal opinion around that is, in statistics, you do get those outliers. You do get an outlier in your data set, and it's difficult to make decisions around that outlier because, it's not falling within your data set. So to be specific, me personally as a farmer, I won't use it to make a lot of decisions, a lot of long-term decisions based on that. Because, like you said, we have seen in Limpopo, but this may be probably 1 in 3 years or 1 in 5 years. So if I'm a farmer in Limpopo, I would still plan again for next year to plant and take my chances. Because if I'm a seasoned farmer, if I'm a continuous farmer, out of the 5 years, I got it right and then lost 1 year. Surely the other 5 years I got it right should be able to carry me through that 1 year.
It's inherently, the risk in terms of environment is very large because you can't control the weather or the climate and things like that. So I definitely understand what you mean as well. It's something farmers probably do go into, knowing that, you can do what you can, but the weather remains the weather, I suppose.
Correct, yes.
And speak about technologies that supplement pest control methods and even with crop protection in terms of the environment as we spoke about now. I don't know if you can share any technologies that you've seen or used in your experience.
We've seen drones spraying. I remember at one of the farmers there, I attended, one of the chemical companies was warning farmers against jumping into using this technology. If you go on a chemical label, it will tell you that if it's aerial spray by aeroplane, you use this dosage. If it's a tank spray by a tractor, you use this dosage. But there's no documentation where you will see that, okay, by drone, you spray is it at this dosage. So they were warning us to say, if you go into problems, you can then come back to us and say, but I sprayed your chemical and it didn't work. How did you spray it? I used a drone. Then, you on your own. So there is technology, yes, but people must be very, very careful how they use it in aligning it to the regulations as well. Because, you can also easily get into trouble with the regulators if, for instance, you get residue and whatnot, and then it's a court case or whatever, and then you find that you didn't abide to the label use of the pesticide. That's one example. There's drones, and there's also a robot. I've seen a robot now at one point which was doing weeding, and they say you program it, you feed it with information of your farm, and then you can simply tell it to go and weed to avoid weeding the crop. And the GPS is on the tractors, the driver assist on the tractors. It has been there for a while, but it's something which some farmers are not aware of. It's used extensively with the grain farmers, but I think most of the vegetables farmers, I think because of the size and the cost, some of them are not aware of it. But it's also good technology which will aid into farming, whether you're spraying, whether you're doing your land prep, harvesting and all that. It also goes to the technical side where in agronomy they will do grid sampling, put it on a computer and they can map to say, put it in a fertilizer spreader and you do your precision spraying or fertilizer to say, okay, this area, as the tractor is moving, it can detect that, okay, at this point of the field, there's less calcium. It puts more calcium there. Or here there's less phosphate, it puts more phosphate there. So you do get such technology helping farmers to do their job. So
quite important that you mentioned regulations, because we did a few episodes back on drone technology, and it was quite interesting to hear that there's several licenses that one needs to acquire before you can even start using drones. So I think it's also important to look at regulations as well, like you said.
Yeah, it's it.
Yeah. And I think this is just out of interest. I've heard that the heat treating of the soil is, an effective method to treating pests. More so I think this is more so with diseases, because the soil sometimes harbors spores for some of the diseases. Is it common in South Africa, though, to be heat treating the soil?
It does work in people with in a greenhouse setup. intensive farmers. We go back to the intensive farmers where you can't expect someone with 1,000 hectares of land to be able to treat the soil, to sterilize the soil that way. But I had people, I think they were doing flowers, who used to do that method where they would treat. But me, personal opinion, I don't like it. I don't believe in it, because then if we are to talk of IPM, then we have eliminated a lot of good microbes in the soil, because it kills everything, the good guys and the bad guys. So what will come back first after you have treated your soil? And then what will come back first to occupy? Because you've created almost like a vacuum bank. As soon as you cool down your soil, what comes back to occupy that soil? You never know. So I am not fond of that method because of that, because then it does, I believe in IPM, where you have to work with nature, to work with the biology. You have to keep your microbes active. So you have to find ways of boosting the good microbes, the good guys. You have to find ways of feeding them in order for them, because the more you have the good guys, which means you have offset the balance of where you now have more good guys and less disease-causing microbes in the soil. So people use it. I think they say they had good results with it, but I would not personally not advise anyone to do that.
Thank you so much to agronomist and horticulturalist Tapiwa Masimba. For more information on this topic, you can visit www.foodformzansi.co.za. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. From me, Patricia Tembo, our technical producer, Megan van der Ven, and the rest of the # team, Food for Mzansi. Thanks for listening.